My name's Jason Taylor from Aviation Climate, and I'm pleased to welcome Stephen Fitzgerald from Ryanair. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Jason.
We're at the Aviation Climate Show here in Heathrow, and the subject is going to be about sustainability within the aviation industry and what Ryanair's doing about it. So I've got a few questions if you don't mind answering.
Sure.
So, actually, no, I'll tell you what, let's start off first of all. So, give me a bit of history about yourself. You work for Ryanair. What's your title and how did you end up there?
Yeah, so I'm Stephen Fitzgerald. I'm Head of Sustainability and Finance for Ryanair. So I've been in the role for the last 18 months or so, and my job encompasses a lot of things, but really leading our sustainability agenda, so managing our environmental goals, and investor and stakeholder engagement on sustainability matters. So within the role, not only do I manage that, but I also look after our fuel procurement process and also our jet fuel hedging and carbon hedging as well. And that's really how I got into the role. So I spent 15 years in banking, and I'm an accountant by trade, and I'm a history of hedge accounting and looking after hedging. So I think that was the natural link into the role. But sustainability is key now, and especially in a hard-to-abate sector like aviation, that really attracted me to joining Ryanair.
Right, thanks for that. So there's a lot to unpack there. So obviously you're an accountant, but you've ended up with, there's not like a few responsibilities there. You've come up with a lot that you need to do. One thing that you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is you said about stakeholders. Now, do stakeholders... is that one of their priorities to make sure that the airline sustainability is key?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more in focus. So not only do we see it on the consumer side, so our customers looking for a more sustainable option, but also across our investor base. So they want to make sure that the company that they're investing in takes sustainability serious, and they've got their own environmental goals and they're progressing towards those goals. And at Ryanair, we put sustainability at the heart of things, and we've have a history of doing that. So if you think back to what Ryanair does, Ryanair is about a low fare, but that's predicated on a low cost model.
Yeah.
And how we do that is making sure we're the most fuel efficient airline in Europe. And pre-pandemic, our emission intensity in the aviation industry is measured in carbon passenger per kilometre.
Yeah.
And we had 66 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometre, which is one of the lowest in the industry.
That is really low.
Yeah, exactly. So we do a lot of operational steps to make sure that we keep our emissions as low as possible. And again, as part of the fuel procurement process and analysing our fuel usage, that's part of my remit. And we've got a number of steps that we're doing right now, but also into the future, we're doing a lot of things that will drive down that number into the future. A key element of that is fleet renewal.
Yeah.
So at Ryanair, we're in the process of taking 210 new game-changer aircraft into the fleet. They'll be in the fleet by 2025, and each one of those aircraft is 16% more fuel efficient than the previous generation. They've got 4% more seats, so we're transporting more guests while burning less fuel, but they're also 40% less noisy. So,
less noisy? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's key at airports and around airports to making sure that we're producing less noise. And it's something that you can really tell when you're on board on takeoff. Sounds like nothing, you know?
Well, you know, the reason why I was asking about that as well, because of the stakeholder, it's intriguing because during this show, I've noticed there's been a lot of play on ESG, i.e. the environmental social governance. And one thing I didn't realise is that actually your leasing cost for your aircraft can come down if you have a good ESG rating. And there's rating agencies to actually get rated. So now I understand the key bit about it.
Well, it's interesting for us. So 90% of our fleet is unencumbered, so we're not really linked to that. Yeah, we don't really have that big a leasing requirement. We do have a number of Airbus that we lease into the fleet through our Lauda AOC. But really, it's about getting the message out there.
So it's genuinely because of sustainability aims and all the rest of it.
Exactly. But I mean, we do engage with rating agencies to make sure that they have our message out there. And interestingly enough, Sustainalytics, who are one of the most prominent...
I've read about them, yeah.
Yeah, so we're
Is that they're the ones that rate you?
They're one of the rating agencies, and we're number one rated airline in Europe, number one large cap airline in the world in terms of rating agency. So the message is getting out there, and the message needs to be centered around what are your emissions and how efficient are you. So we operate on a point-to-point model, so not a hub and spoke.
Yeah.
So we're not doing extra flights just for the sake of it, and that's the most efficient way of connecting Europe. Really, it's on a point-to-point basis, and also doing all those operational steps that are kind of best practice that we've been doing for a number of years. So continuous descent approaches, sustained at a high altitude for longer. I mean, that's key, and we've been doing that where possible, where air traffic management allows us to, we'll look to do it. And we publish stats on this monthly, like how many approaches we've had. Another thing is single engine taxi. So once you land, and if the taxi time allows it, switching off one engine. And again, we're so transparent on this sort of stuff that on a monthly basis, we'll put up on our website not only our CO2 per passenger kilometre, but also the amount of single engine taxis that we do as well. So we're really trying to be progressive and transparent in our ESG messages.
Right, okay. So, I mean, obviously SAF is a massive topic at this show at the moment, and I want to slightly play devil's advocate here. So SAF is a very admirable aim, and obviously you've said you're going to be using SAF and going forwards. But one thing that I'm not sure about is the actual amount of feedstock available, which will make even the slightest dent on the amount of fuel you use. I mean, you use a lot of fuel. What's your thoughts on that? Because SAF is, in my mind, in short supply based on the use in Europe and worldwide.
Yeah, look, I agree that there needs to be work done to scale up SAF production. And in terms of the feedstock base, we need to think broad, but the feedstocks need to be as sustainable as possible at the same time. So not impacting on land use change, not impacting on food either. So that has to be key and at the centre of any policy. The way I think about it though is there's not one feedstock, there's a whole load of feedstocks, and there's not one production pathway. There's 7 approved production pathways at the minute. And when we talk to our fuel suppliers and their own capabilities in this space, they're not focused on one pathway. So they're not focused specifically on HEFA. A lot of them are coming up with all different types of SAF. So we quite recently announced a partnership with OMV to provide SAF out to 2030. And they're looking at 4 different production pathways. So they're looking at co-processing, they're looking at alcohol to jet, they're looking at HEFA, but they're also looking at the most advanced type of SAF, which is the synthetic fuels as well. So we take encouragement that, like SAF will be in short supply and there will be constraints, but if we continue to invest in it, if the industry does, and there's clear signals from airlines that, we want to use SAF, then production capability will ramp up and it won't be focused specifically on one type of feedstock or one type of production method. So with that in mind, we set an ambitious goal for 2030 that we'd be using 12.5% SAF on our flights by then, which is double what the EU mandates.
It's pretty admirable.
Pretty high. But
ambitious, shall we say.
Ambitious, but we're confident we'll get there. And the reason we're confident is we talk to our key fuel producers on a daily basis and they tell us how much SAF they're going to be producing. And say Shell, which are probably our biggest fuel provider, they're looking at 10% of their jet fuel by 2030 as being SAF. So we take confidence in that. Another thing that we're doing just to make sure that we get the right feedstock and the right type of SAF is we're investing in research in this space. So we have a partnership with Trinity College Dublin through the Sustainable Aviation Research Centre, and they're looking at different feedstocks and what the life cycle greenhouse gas emission reductions of that feedstock are. So we want to make sure that we invest in the right SAF with the right partners and that the SAF that we use is truly sustainable.
So Trinity are doing a project. Is that ongoing now?
It's ongoing right now. So what we do is we act as a point of contact for them. So not only can we tell them, look, this is how our flights are performing, and we'll give them data, because it's not just SAF that they're focused on. They're looking at different propulsion types. They're looking at noise mapping as well. But specifically on the SAF side, we put them in contact with our fuel providers as well. And for instance, we've started taking SAF in Amsterdam Schiphol Airport with Neste, and Neste are the kind of main SAF producers, definitely from a HEFA point of view anyway. And the interaction that they have is kind of getting information from Neste in terms of how they're producing the SAF and the feedstocks that they're using. So we'll have a good idea as to how sustainable a type of feedstock truly is.
Right, okay. So if that's the case, because you see, you can get all the SAF, and I'm sure you've seen a few talks today, but airline costs are going up, probably carbon and all the rest of it's going to be getting up there with personnel and fuel at some point. What's your thoughts on the market? So, for example, I was talking to a guy who's going to produce SAF in the US. They are getting huge concessions, state-wise, federal-wise, and it's making it completely available. It makes sense to the airline. They're buying it at sometimes the same price as Jet A1. What do you think needs to happen in Europe to make it? Because you can do all this stuff, but it's an admirable aim, and it's great. I mean, it is saving emissions, but it's costing you maybe 3 or 4 times as much.
Yeah.
So do you think, and you need to claim the credits back as well, which we can't.
That's a key concern. So the Fit for 55 legislation, as it's currently laid out, and I know it's going through a trilogue process at the minute, but as it's currently laid out, there are benefits in there to pick up SAF. So there are incentives built in. So the biggest one is that any SAF use wouldn't count towards your ETS requirements, which is huge.
Yeah,
so
of course.
When you think of where the cost of ETS allowances have gone in the last 12 months, that will be a big benefit towards it. But another element is that auction revenues from the ETS will be reinvested back in the industry, and that's something that I've been quite vocal on.
That'd
and
be
Ryanair has
fantastic.
been absolutely that. We can start investing back in aviation, start investing in SAF. As we see it, it's the kind of key to decarbonising aviation over the medium term. So we see other elements being having a role to play in decarbonising aviation, like hydrogen aircraft, electric aircraft. But really, out to 2050, SAF is key. So that gives us heart. But you're absolutely right. The US regulatory framework is more laid out to incentivise the procurement of SAF rather than the EU, which kind of punishes you for not picking up SAF, so to speak.
It's the
carrot and stick.
Carrot and stick. Yes,
exactly. So I mean, we take heart in some of the recent developments in Europe, but more needs to be done. More incentives need to be done at a national level to incentivise the use of SAF. And look, we see schemes taking place in Sweden through Swedavia, where if you're picking up SAF in excess of mandates, they'll look to incentivise that, and similar schemes are being rolled out in other countries like Spain through IENA. So the more we see of that kind of thing, I think the more airlines will look to procure SAF, and that will give more certainty to the fuel producers to start scaling up the production capabilities.
Right, okay. Because I mean, I know obviously Ryanair is not exactly a quiet airline when it comes to commenting on industry and all the rest of it. So, I've seen the classics about Boris Johnson, but are you lobbying government or central government or European government about this stuff? Or
we're quite vocal on having a level playing field. So the best example of this is the emission trading system. So the ETS only applies to intra-European travel.
Yeah.
And that puts a burden on Europe trying to connect with itself. So Europeans going to visit friends and family. So basically, there's a carbon tax applied for visiting friends and family across Europe that doesn't apply for a rich traveller going from Dublin to New York on a shopping trip. And that's what we don't want to see. We don't want to see the burden of decarbonising aviation placed solely on intra-European carriers and Europeans.
You're talking about full scope, obviously.
I'm talking about full scope. So, I mean, it's interesting to see Eurocontrol data that says 5% of flights contribute basically 50% of Europe's emissions, and they're the long-haul flights. And so it's crazy to think that those flights aren't in scope for the ETS. And we'd like to see that. And that's one thing that the European Parliament, as part of its review of the ETS, has said, no, it should apply, full scope should apply, and that ETS should apply to all flights that depart the EEA. And that's something that we're vocal on and supportive of. So let's hope that common sense prevails and that comes through. The other element is, again, the Energy Taxation Directive, where, again, there'd be a kerosene tax only applicable to intra-European travel. again, it doesn't make sense for the burden to be placed solely on intra-European carriers. So we'd like to see common sense prevail on that as well.
Listen, Steve, I know you've pushed for time. You've got to go to another conference, but hopefully we can have another chat about things, because there's loads I want to cover. There's loads to unpack, like, for example, EU full scope. I get where you're coming from.